listening to you all and learning together. So thank you for your time and your trust in me to say something, hopefully that you will find useful and or compelling. So today, Claire has put up the slide of the title of my talk, and so we're going to be talking about a particular kind of feminicide in the US, but I want to contextualize my work just for a second to say that as an anthropologist, I really had the good fortune and the privilege to grow up working in Guatemala with Indigenous, with Maya scholars and activists who were thinking about violence in the context of genocide and feminicide in that context. So it's really to them that I owe a great deal of credit for their trust and their confidence and trust, right, in sharing with me. And that work and that community is really what started the analytic lens that I bring to you all today for thinking about a particular kind of feminicides in the United States. So let me begin formally with where the inquiry goes, and then I'll take a little bit of time to work through that. So Claire, maybe you could put the next slide up for us. I don't know if you can. Okay. So let me just say before I begin, I just have a few slides, and the slides that I have and what I want to underscore are women, the lives of the women in their life that I'm going to be talking about today. So just a few images of women, and then maybe a little bit of data if we make it that far at the end. So today I want to begin with an unsolved murder that happened in the rural United States about 3 decades ago. And it's the murder of Tammy Zawicki, who you see enjoying her life there on the slides. Tammy was abducted on Interstate 80 in Illinois while driving west from Evanston, Illinois, when her car broke down on Sunday, August 23rd, 1992. At the time, she was 21 years old and on her way back to campus at Grinnell College, where I work, where Claire did her undergraduate degree. And she was a senior, at the time she was a senior majoring in Spanish. One day later, Illinois State Police found her car on the shoulder of the interstate, said it was abandoned, right, designated it abandoned, and had it towed. The same day, her mother, Joanne Zawicki, contacted the police to say her daughter never made it back to college and was missing. 9 days later, on Tuesday, September 1st, 1992, Tammy's lifeless body was found along Interstate 44 in rural Missouri, wrapped in a red blanket and bound with duct tape. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed 8 times, which resulted in her death, and dental records were used to identify her body. Tammy's murder is unsolved to date, and the case remains open with the FBI and the Illinois State Police. It was actually recently covered by People magazine investigative work on the Discovery Channel a couple of weeks ago. And her family and friends are still advocating for justice, some now almost 3 decades later. And the specter of her unsolved murder shadows many of us who remember it vividly, even now as years have passed. Thank you, Claire. So the loss of, let me stop there and say what I'm interested in doing in this talk and in the work more broadly is thinking about the way that murders of women count and don't count, by which I mean those that are rendered visible and those that are rendered invisible. So the dialectic that I really want us to hopefully trace as we move throughout this material is what is highlighted, what is obfuscated, right? And the play between those two things, which is how we arrive at memory and erasure in my title, right? That which is remembered is visible, and that which is occluded, right? Or that which is occluded or erased is the other side of that. So the steps that I want to go through, here's where I hope we travel together, that we think about a little bit about US exceptionalism when we are talking about feminicide, right? And how we do and don't recognize, how we don't recognize feminicide in the US and what that means. I would then like to, and I want to there rely upon all of the fantastic work by feminist scholars in Latin America, by Indigenous women in the US and Canada, in terms of how we should be thinking about feminicides, both in documenting them and rendering them visible. I then want to move from and thinking about Tammy's case to thinking about other cases through an intersection, necessarily an intersectional lens. Then from thinking about intersectionality, I want to continue that thread of thinking about which is visible and invisible by using some of the tools from linguistic anthropology that are closest to me in terms of circulation and how narratives circulate or don't circulate and why. And again, that's about the dialectic between the visible and the invisible. And then if time allows us, then to take one more turn into thinking about memory and invisibility through kind of the materiality of remembering and forgetting in terms of the highway as a particular kind of cultural site. And so that's where I hope we go. And I think Claire said that the chat will be on throughout the talk. So if there's something that occurs to you that you want to address or return to, you're welcome to put it in the chat, and then we'll deal with those. I won't deal with those questions now, but we'll deal with them together at the end. So we'll go back, we'll circuitously go back to Tammy's murder in the context of other murders for a moment. Okay. So according to the FBI, Tammy was one of 4,936 women who were victims of homicide in 1992. So how many of those women were abducted before they were murdered? How many of them were victims of sexual violence before they died? How many of their bodies were moved from one location to another along the highway system in the United States? Basically today, right, the answers to those questions remain elusive. The FBI doesn't make those records accessible to the general public. I think as many folks who work on those issues know, there is some voluntary reporting among agents of the law, but they're free to participate or not participate, provide that data. And so still trying to analytically make sense of the kinds of murders that we're talking about and the way that identities and processes intersect with them is something that I think remains elusive to us. So from that perspective, then, I think Claire, maybe we can go to the next slide. How can we render what is invisible visible? And here, of course, I think for this audience, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this point, but I will say again, that really the work of Latin American activists, scholars, folks from the Global South have provided necessary intervention into shifting this idea of homicides and the murder of women to understanding legally, ethically, politically the idea of feminicide, as we know from feminicidio. And I've just put the definition from Fregoso and Bejarano up for us. I'm sure in this context, those of us who are working on this are familiar with the analytic frame. But why feminicide over femicide? Why do we need it? What does it do for us? And of course, I mean, I think we all know that we're not talking about the murder, just the simple murder of women and counting that, but we're thinking about power. We're thinking about the intersection of gender with other aspects of identity. We're thinking about the role of the state, and all of those must be unnecessarily brought into the analytic lens and it really into public discourse and to legal discourse when we are thinking about accounting for crimes like Tammy's and thousands of other women that we want to raise awareness of and intervene in. So the next thing that I do, and for this audience, I won't spend a lot of time so we can maybe get into more additional aspects of where this might go. But I think if we take the necessarily critical lens that we get from women and scholars in the Global South, we can see that there's clear evidence that that the murder of Tammy Zawicki was in fact a feminicide, even though it's classified as a highway homicide to the state. Okay, so I want to cover a few of those in terms of the work of remembering her life and where justice is with that today. Okay, so let me just make a few points there. How is Tammy's murder clearly a feminicidio? So her car broke down. We know she was abducted. The relationship of gender to the crime, because it becomes explicit when we understand that sexual assault and eventual murder were the outcomes of her abduction. Some additional points. When her body was discovered, she was wearing undergarments that were not her own. The murder shows ritualistic aspects. And I think the overall point there is that clearly we see that the violence is rooted in a power structure that has to do with sexual torture, bodily mutilation, things that are in excess, they're excessive, and that point to a broader cultural system of misogyny and dehumanization, that must be embedded in culture and power. I think it's really important. It's really important as we work on these issues it's very easy to dismiss this as some people have written to me and said, well, it's these people who committed this crime are clearly deviant. They're not, it's a deviant person. It's not, it's exceptional. And I think we can challenge the idea of exceptionality when we think about the way that such crimes are activating a broader gender cultural imaginary. And there I would say the crime was opportunistic. So whoever randomly happened across Tammy Zawicki was primed for this crime through participation in a larger historical cultural framework that regularized the subordinate status of women, their harm, and their degradation. It becomes only imaginable or thinkable in this broader cultural context. Okay, so that's the part of the crime. Now thinking about the role of the state and its negligence in terms of the investigation and why we have to think about holding the state accountable, as our good colleagues throughout the Americas have told us. The state, clearly has the failure of exercising due diligence in the case of Tammy. And I'll just cover a few of those points. At the beginning of the investigation, when Joanne Zawicki reported Tammy missing, the police did not start investigating the crime for 3 days. Instead, they told the Zawicki family that Tammy had probably gone off with her boyfriend. Well, she's not really missing, she's gone off with her boyfriend. And it didn't really matter that she didn't have a boyfriend at the time. So right, there's this invocation of stereotypical gender roles and kind of, sexist ideas about women were activated by law enforcement as a justification for their failure not to act. Other aspects of the investigation shows kind of the accrual of insufficient and ineffectual law enforcement. Let me tell you those. After her car was classified as abandoned, it was towed to the police station and left outside. By the time the fingerprint crew started to work, so many people had touched the car that there was nothing left to dust. So, right, evidence was just destroyed. After her body was discovered in rural Missouri, witnesses at a gas station nearby where the body was found had reported seeing a truck and a trailer that might be linked to the case. Yet police, who initially said they had collected receipts from the filling station, never did, and those receipts were thrown away. And the Illinois State Police said the oversight happened because they were, quote, simply stretched too thin. No named witnesses, people or interests or suspects were ever able to be charged. There was a person of interest who a man who drove, who was a truck driver, who lived in Missouri, and his wife was in Illinois and was questioned at the time, but he and so he was questioned but never brought in. There were 14 staff assigned to the Zwickey Task Force, which was disbanded a few months after the murder. And so the one kind of key suspect died in 2002. His wife hasn't been interviewed, and that's what's happening. Okay, so what does it do? Tammy's case then, what I'm making an argument for, and I think it's not hard for us, is to, if we think about it analytically and legally through the lens of feminicide, there's plenty of evidence. Okay, for the idea that we should be thinking politically, self-consciously in an organized way about moving from homicide to feminicide in US legal discourse. Yes. Okay. Now I want to move into, I want to move further, right, away from Tammy and to complicating maybe how we, the analysis that I've given you. So certainly Tammy's case was famous. It made the national headlines for weeks. Right, and if we think about that from an intersectional perspective, we understand that Tammy, of course, was a white woman, a college student, and came from a family that could afford to send her to college, and became kind of good women who are abducted. And yet, if we leave our analysis there, we understand that's insufficient, right? Because that crime is visible, what crimes aren't visible. And certainly there, we would go to the work of American Indian women in the United States who have been advocating for rendering visible the astronomical numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women that are completely erased, right, at the intersection of class and race in this country, that are not counted at all and not rendered visible by the state. And also what we know to be really epidemic in this country today, the murder of young trans women of color in the US that don't make headlines the same way Tammy did. Okay, so I want to be clear that I'm not saying that Tammy's case shouldn't have received all the attention it did. Of course it should, but as should all cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, murder of trans women of color. We have to bring those into the same analytic frame from an intersectional perspective. So as we're thinking through that, I want to try to say, okay, how do we do that then? How might we think about the way that murders of some women are rendered visible, not in terms of the state, but in terms of in terms of public culture and which ones don't unfold in the same way. And there is the second move. I'd like us to go to, I'd like us to consider the idea of circulation. And what I'm concerned about here are circulation of stories, right? Circulation of narratives of missing and murdered women. Here I'm relying on the work of linguistic anthropologist Charles Briggs, who has written in some very important ways, I would say, about narratives of violence in Venezuela. And Briggs is thinking about infanticide, but his work is really about how and why narratives of violence get taken up, right? How they get taken up and how they get passed around. Formally, he calls that idea cartographies of communicability. And what he's trying to get at are the ways that particular narratives of violence, and in this case, we're talking about the violence of feminicide, the violence of feminicide, how they circulate or don't circulate. And what I want to advocate for then is how we might think about, analytically, kind of mapping out what he calls cartographies of communicability, which is to say how narratives, particular narratives of violence, circulate and get reproduced, right? So what stories become heard, and then how those stories get replicated kind of across different social fields. So what I'm trying to do is move from the visibility and invisibility of the state and legal system to now move into a more cultural domain when we're thinking about the circulation of stories and mapping those out. So now, following that, I want to step into two, let me see how my time is. I want to step into two other murders and to give you a sense of, to begin to outline a sense of what the analysis might look like. Claire, maybe you can put the next slide, which should be of Molly Tibbetts, I think. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to turn to outline a little bit, just a bit about two more recent murders to give you a sense of what this might look like. So we'll go to the more recent murder of Molly Tibbetts, who went missing on July 18th, 2018. I want to pause for a minute and just say that the three specific murders that I'm talking about today, and feminicidios, I would say, in each case, of Tammy, of Molly Tibbetts, and of a woman named Sadie Alvarado, these are all, these are feminicides that I didn't look for, that came to me, right? That came to me in terms of the personal, political, historical, geographical context in which I find myself living. So all of these three feminicides are ones that were close to me in some way. Not in terms of people necessarily that I knew, but in terms of proximity, in terms of culture, in terms of location. So, and it's not fortuitous. And I think it bears reflection that I did not need to look for these cases. Okay, so that brings us to Molly Tibbetts, whose poster you see here. Molly Tibbetts was a 20-year-old college student at the University of Iowa. Much like Tammy, she was a young college student who was abducted. So she went to the University of Iowa, and she was from Brooklyn, Iowa, which is about 15 minutes from Grinnell College, where I work, where Tammy went to school. And indeed, Molly's mom works in the town of Grinnell. She just happens to be someone that I've known casually for many years. It was a summer. Molly was out jogging. She was a runner, and she went missing. And she went missing, and that produced a national search for her, wanted signs, billboards, and folks, law enforcement looking everywhere for her. And what I've given you here is a billboard that was reproduced outside of Chicago, right, along the highway there, to try to track, to help identify where Molly was. And again, because she was abducted from the road, there was a lot of concern about where she had been taken, and kind of the transitory nature of these crimes, which I'm focused on in terms of the highway. And so about a month later, Molly's body was found by a young man who was a suspect in the crime, who took law enforcement, who led them to the location of her body, which was in a cornfield very near where she had been abducted. That crime has been, a suspect has been arrested. Okay, so while the search was on for Molly and it was making national headlines, at the same time, there was another murder, another body found in approximately the same area. So Claire, maybe we could go to the next slide. Okay, and I give you what were headlines at the time, and I want to be, back, Claire, sorry. And the headlines all over the place, in Iowa and the region: discovery of a woman's body in rural Iowa, not Molly Tibbetts. And so I give you that as a piece of data, as a piece of evidence, because if we're thinking about circulation and how stories and narratives get replicated, how they circulate, then headlines matter. And the headline was, and this was like in August, it was August 5th, I think, another body was found in rural Iowa. And the headlines were this: discovery of women's body, not Molly Tibbetts, and another and another and another. So the story that circulated was that there was a body, but it wasn't Molly Tibbetts, right? We're still looking for her. And that, of course, is a moment both of visibility in the terms of underscoring the search for Molly Tibbetts, and a moment of erasure, because the body of the woman, the identity of the woman and who this woman was, is not rendered visible until if you decide to read, right? So that matters, and that's what I mean about cartographies of communicability, in that we can trace what's highlighted and what's erased. And so so as we follow that narrative, if you go past the headlines, you will find out that the body belonged to another 20-year-old woman from Iowa, whose name was Sadie Alvarado. And she was a 21-year-old woman. Alvarado, right, we understand to be a Hispanic, a name that's marked as a Latino, or at least of Hispanic origin, from the town of Muscatine, Iowa, which has a high Latino population. And it's not a story that made headlines anywhere, right? Her name was not rendered visible. So I think this brings us into that intersectional place of thinking about the ways that the murders of particular kind of women are visible. But if we bring in race, and we bring in race and we bring class into the analytic frame, we immediately see the inequality, right? So if we stay with an analysis of feminicide and we consider further the details of Sadie Alvarado's death, what becomes rendered visible, again, I would argue, is another instance where the lens of feminicide becomes really germane and absolutely essential to what we do. So and her body, of course, was found along the side of the road. So let me return to feminicide. We're okay on time, yes. And let me return to the feminicide analytic frame again. If we look into the circumstances surrounding the death of Sadie Alvarado, then we start to see evidence of narratives that lead us back to the analytic frame of feminicide of a different sort. And so let me outline a few of those for you. So as the investigation, there was an investigation into Sadie Alvarado's death, right? Which was certainly, of course, it's very suspicious when we find the body of a woman along the side of the road. So that certainly became investigated locally. And what happened was, shortly thereafter, the man who was Sadie Alvarado's boyfriend was arrested. And here are some details of his account of what happened. He said that they were driving together in his car. They were involved in a fight. And in the middle of the fight, Sadie Alvarado jumped out of the car that was traveling at a high speed. And so she jumped out of the car, and he left her there after she jumped out of the car, drove home to where he was from, approximately 30 or 40 minutes away, and didn't do anything until the next day, approximately 24 hours later, or maybe 18 hours later. He went back to look for her and didn't find her. So eventually he was arrested. He was arrested. Now, if we think about feminicides that are based upon that are the product not of abduction, but of intimate partner violence, then the words and the perspective of Sadie Alvarado's father becomes, and his questions become really important. So her father raised the questions, well, why would she have jumped from a speeding car? She didn't have a history of erratic behavior. She seemed committed to life. She didn't have any history of depression. So her father immediately problematized this idea that a woman in the middle of a fight would just randomly jump from the car. And he also raised the question about if she in fact jumped from the car the way that her boyfriend reported, her body would have been found on the other side of the road. An autopsy revealed that she died from blunt force trauma to the head. So as we think about her loss and the kinds of narratives that we see often in the context of intimate partner violence, where women act erratically, strangely, and then accidentally die in very strange circumstances that their partner just can't explain, right? We know that is an iterative narrative that we can find in cases of feminicide in lots of contexts. And I'm thinking in this moment, Claire, particularly of your work, right? But it's certainly not, it's a narrative of women dying accidentally in heated circumstances that resonates, I think, with us deeply as another kind of feminicide, which has never been taken up in the case of Sadie Alvarado in public discourse in any way. And I will say that the boyfriend was convicted of leaving the scene of a crime and given a prison sentence of 5 years. And I think there's a lot more to be said about that. So that, I think, I hope that gives you a sense of thinking about how we should be tracking the circulation of narratives from an intersectional perspective. Whose narratives, in what context, which ones are elevated, which ones are not. And I think with the little bit of time that I have left, if you'll permit me, I want to turn for just a moment to think about other ways that memory and erasure are activated, and to return to, or to then return circuitously toward the murder of Tammy as a way that we can illustrate those points for thinking about the materiality, kind of alluded to this, the materiality of the road and the highway as an important cultural site for activating memory, at least in the US context, where we can think about the road and kind of the ways that it becomes semiotically loaded as an important site of danger, right, and or violence. So Claire, maybe we can go to the last couple of slides. And here, I want to talk about the road as a lieu de mémoire following the work of scholars of memory, thinking about the road as a place, the highway, in the murders and in the murders and the deaths, in the murders and deaths of all these women, right? The highway is a potent symbol, and I think culturally we can track that in all sorts of ways. But what I want to suggest then are two things: that memories, including my own of Tammy's murder, which is the place that I stepped into this analysis, and the way that memories circulate they're located individually, right? But they're shared collectively. They resonate because they belong to a broader social collectivity. So here I want to go just for a second to Hobsbawm, and then what you have, where I have the highway as a lieu de mémoire, as a site of memory. It's a little bit of data from some work that I've done with folks who knew Tammy. So I want to underscore for us that while we think about memory, my memory, so-and-so's memory, as particular and as idiosyncratic, that memory from an anthropological perspective is always inherently social, right? It's located, it's activated through the collectivities to which we belong. And let me quote just for a bit, I think, because I will have the indulgence of time, Hobsbawm, and he says this: "One is rather astonished when reading psychological treatises that deal with memory to find that people are considered as isolated beings, to divide all the bonds which attach individuals to their society of fellows. Yet it is, and this is the part that matters to me, yet it is in society that people normally acquire their memories. It is also in society that they recall, recognize, and localize their memories. Memories are recalled to me externally, and the groups of which I am a part at any time give me the means to reconstruct them. It is in this sense that there exists a collective memory and social frameworks for memory. It is to the degree that our individual thoughts places itself in these frameworks and participates in this memory that we are capable of the active recollection." So following this thread, the haunting memories that I carry of Tammy Zawicki's disappearance and murder, while my own, belong not only to me, but the social collectivities to which Tammy Zawicki and I both belong. To put it another way, individual memories count, right, are rendered visible because they aggregate along social lines that are shared. And this brings me to the last couple of slides that I will leave you with. Claire, can we go back just for a second and I'll contextualize that one? I'm arriving there. So what I've given you here on this slide and the subsequent one are two memories that were shared with me by different women who are both connected to the Grinnell College community of which Tammy and I are a part. They're separated by many generations. So the first that I have here for you is Rachel Bly. Rachel Bly, who now works for Grinnell College, was a classmate of Tammy's. And you can see here what this is kind of what she shared with me and thinking, reflecting on that time. Is anyone else in danger? Is this whole thing? And you realize it wasn't targeted per se. It was targeted only in the sense that her car broke down. driving all of a sudden became super scary. It changed the way you thought about all of that. So Bly's memories of Tammy's disappearance and murder also turned toward the anticipated future possibility of encountering the potential perpetrator on the road. She recalled, everywhere you went, you were looking for the truck. For years, I honestly, probably for 10 years, looked for that truck unconsciously. Every time I saw a truck with stripes, it was like, is this the truck? Is this the truck? The truck is still, even now, occasionally a thing that will spark in my mind. So what I want to say is, right, for women and women who are connected to that place in time, the road and being on the road and thinking about that space, it's not part of the past. It's not confined to the past. That those are things that arise in the present spontaneously. And in this way, the collective memories of violent pasts are brought into the present and into the future, right? In other words, I'm very interested in connecting to the future horizon of danger. So we're not talking about something that's relegated to the past. We're talking about something that lives on in the present, which is precisely why one of the reasons we step into these conversations. And I will, Claire, maybe we can go to the last slide. And I want to give you another example, another piece of data, if you will, from a different, from another perspective. So this is another discussion that I had with a woman who was a current Grinnell student. So we're talking, 2 generations at least. Of space between Tammy Zawicki and this young woman's experience at Grinnell College. She's an international student. She didn't know Tammy. She didn't know anything about the murder. And yet, that's Rachel. Can we go one more, Claire? I don't know if you can. Do you have it?
The next slide is the Lou de Memoir.
Yeah. Can we? Yes. Is there one more? Yes, there. That's perfect. Thank you. So what I have here is an excerpt from an interview that I did with a contemporary Grinnell student. And she didn't know Tammy. She is an international student, so she didn't have the history of circulation, yet she spontaneously stepped into thinking about the murder of Tammy and what it means for the present and future. And so this young woman, her name is Suji Son, she and a classmate ended up doing a performance piece about, and it was called Who Killed Tammy Zawicki? And so she was reflecting on that work and the choices that she made in representing that, right? So, and you have it. Sorry, I won't read you the whole quote, but really she's talking about, again, as an embodied experience, she's going to the highway and thinking about the highway as this site of danger, of potency, of what it may have been, and asks the people who are participating in her performance to step into that site, right? That site of memory is what I mean. Where one can remember and think about that experience in the past. And again, what stands out, one of the things that stands out for me in doing this work is the way that this particular young woman, again, talked about the history, right? That as part of the past, but it's germane because we live it in the present and it steps into the future. And there she says, like, nothing has really changed. We have new technologies. She was talking about the use of cell phone, and we have new things. But then people still think the same and nothing has really changed. So are we really progressing? And what she's talking about is the way that we think about violence against women, the way that murders remain unsolved, and that really the cultural system that enables these kinds of crimes and locating the particular ones that involve the highway, and as something that lives on in the present and makes the future more precarious. I think that I will just, I'll thank you for your patience and conclude there just by saying that this like cursory analysis that I've tried to trace out for you, I think helps us as I don't know, like urges us as scholars and as activists and as citizens to not, as we're thinking about memory and we're thinking about the past, it pushes us toward the horizon of the future. And what are the possible futures that we're imagining? The future is indeterminate. So for me, kind of the next place that I want to go, or where I think I want to step with this, is that just as we engage thinking about memory and erasure in the past, the complement to that is really thinking about the future, right? And what are the possible futures that we, as agents or as bystanders or participants, what are the possible futures that we are imagining, that we are invested in creating? And I think certainly the experiences, right, that we have all had in the past year about the indeterminacy of the future really underscores that we should be inquiring into that now as we think about feminicide throughout the hemisphere. So I'll conclude there. And I'll thank you all for your time and your patience, and I'll be really happy to engage with any ideas that you have.